On this episode of China Unscripted, filmed at the Oslo Freedom Forum, we interviewed BBC Dad to talk about why North Korea needs China, how Kim Jong-Un is like Don Corleone, and World Wars IV, V, and VI. Hi, welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And joining us today, we have Robert Kelly, an American political analyst on North and South Korea. He's also a professor of political science at Pusan National University. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. So I think what we need to get out of the way first is, you are the most famous person who has ever been on our podcast. We just have to get this out of the way, you understand. So you became famous as BBC Dad.
That's correct.
When you were giving an interview on BBC,
right.
And your lovely children, one by one, ran into the room.
Thank you.
And so now that we all know that, did you want to comment on that? I'm sure you've spoken enough about that.
What's there to say at this point?
Do you still get recognized?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, people recognize me at this thing. People come up to me during the donor lunch and were talking to me about it just a couple hours ago.
I hope that meant they wanted to give you money.
No.
That's actually one of the big conspiracy theories, right? That somehow like we did this to become famous or have like a YouTube channel or like following the Kardashian or following the Kellys or something. I don't know, whatever. We were supposed to do like a YouTube.
Or because you're R. Kelly.
Like something like, I know, whatever. And there's all this sort of like media hype about whether or not we're going to like turn this into like some channel or a TV show. We're going to monetize this somehow or whatever. I don't know. I mean, we made a little bit of money off of it. I mean, that's what people often ask. So in the interest of full disclosure, we made some, not very much. No, it wasn't scripted. It wasn't faked. We didn't do it for any of that kind of stuff. And we don't have a YouTube channel. I mean, people are like, oh, you should put your kids' faces on like baseball hats and tennis shoes or socks and T-shirts and all that. We didn't do any of that. The whole like following the Kardashians, keeping up with the. We didn't do any of that. So we just didn't do it. That doesn't interest us. And I don't know anything about that. I'm not a celebrity. I don't know anything about pop culture. I don't do that at all. I'm like a
You
dork.
study North and South Korea.
I'm like 46. I don't know anything about that stuff, right? What do I know, man? I'm like old, right? So, I don't know. I mean, I just have no interest in that. We just dropped it immediately. My kids are really young too, and I'm like, we worry a lot about like, are they getting overexposed, and do we want this? And maybe if they were like 10 or 12 or something, and they had some ability to cognitively understand what had happened. But even my daughter, I mean, she's 6, she has a vague sense of it, but she's 6, right? She just doesn't understand that.
Well, I can't imagine people
a billion
recognize
people
her.
watch this video and everything. Oh yeah, people recognize her all the time.
Really?
Yeah, sure. Some woman came up to us the other day at the store, and and if the kids were a little bit older, maybe we might have flirted with some of these more outlandish schemes to like get rich off of it or something. It'd be nice to be rich, but I mean, in principle, we have no idea, and we don't really care, and we just moved on. But it's still hanging around, and people still talk about it, and people get dressed up as us for Halloween and stuff like that.
Really?
They do, yeah. Look it up.
Oh my gosh.
It's all out there on the internet, man. Just type like BBC Dad into Google or Bing or whatever, and just scroll
Chris,
through.
No one is dressed up as you for the Halloween.
For Halloween, yeah. I need to rethink my strategy.
This is why we did say that you are the most famous person we've ever had on the show.
For reasons that have nothing to do with your show.
I mean, you are more famous than the former Parliament member we had on our show.
Yeah, nobody knows his name.
Yeah, it was from Canada, so I mean.
All right. So there's something I want to show you before I go on.
This is the previous expert on North Korea that I had interviewed at International Workers' Day in New York.
All right.
So you might get a kick out of this American's thoughts about North Korea.
Okay.
Do you think North Korea or America is a better place to live?
Certainly the DPRK. I mean, people don't starve to death in the DPRK like they do here every day. I mean, how many people in poor parts of the United States have starved to death since we started this rally today? How many people have starved to death in Appalachia? How many people have starved to death in Harlem? There are more homeless people there are more empty houses than homeless people in the United States.
So,
wow. So he wasn't just some balloon head off the street either. He knew that North Korea is the DPRK. That means he actually knows.
Oh yeah, he was one of the organizers of the International Workers' Day rally, and I don't want to give his name because I don't want to dox him. But like, what's your reaction to that?
There are fellow travelers throughout the West, right? I mean, the guy who threw the milkshake at Tae-Young-ho yesterday at this event.
Who is the famous North Korean
Yeah.
defector who was a former ambassador.
I mean, there are, right? I mean, you know, there's still Marxists drifting around and stuff like that. I mean, they're still there and stuff like that. I will admit that guys will defend the DPRK. That's pretty exceptional. I mean, you really don't see that much anymore. That does kind of amaze me. I would say that we now have enough nonpartisan information about North Korea that I think that position is no longer sustainable. The usual argument that I hear when I talk about things like the famine and stuff in the late 1990s is, oh, well, you know, that's all from USAID or the CIA, you know, or USFK, U.S. Forces Korea, right, or the South Korean version of the CIA, which is called the National Intelligence Service, NIS. You know, that's all just NIS propaganda, whatever, right? And so this is one of the reasons why the UN did a big investigation of North Korean human rights about 8 years ago, right? Starting, I don't know, yeah, like 8 years ago, I think. And it was called the Commission of Inquiry into the Status of Human Rights in the DPRK. The short version is called the Kirby Report because it was led by an Australian jurist named Michael Kirby, and you can download it. And the Kirby Report basically says that all this stuff about how horrific North Korea is true, right? And that's really important because it's from the UN, right? So when that guy says that North Korea is actually this great place and people aren't starving and stuff like that, you can actually read a third-party outsider group, not me, not some American or some hawk or some ideologue or Republicans or South Korean conservatives or whatever, but like a third-party entity that will say that North Korea is, in fact, a slave state. So yeah, my sense is, I mean, I've sat on panels where this gets kicked around, and I just don't understand this. To me, the metaphysical debate about North Korea, about whether or not it's an Orwellian tyranny, that debate is over. That ship has sailed. You can read the UN report and all 360 pages of its brutality, like what the North Koreans do, collective punishment, infanticide, you know, rape, I mean, all the gulags, it's all there in black and white. It's easily accessible. That debate is over. I mean, that gentleman is simply wrong.
So North Korea is not the true Korea?
No, North Korea is a cul-de-sac of Korean history that has no real roots or reference points in Korean history. It's a failed experiment from the Cold War and really doesn't provide a model for anything really in the world, right? I mean, nobody models themselves off the DPRK. In Korean history, Korea never had anything like an absolute kingship along these lines. The old, it was called the Chosun Dynasty. The Chosun Dynasty never had anything like the camp system and the police state and stuff like that. I mean, it was a monarchy, right? But a fairly benign feudal kind of one, right? I mean, where the issues were more like poverty and serfdom and stuff like that, not this kind of like harsh Orwellian 1984 style brutality. That's real new, right? And Kim Il-sung got that from the Soviets. I mean, there's very little that's Korean about North Korea's political structure.
The Soviets and also the Bible, I hear.
Yeah, there's this whole sort of argument floating around out there that Kim Il-sung's grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, and he got this idea of like this sort of like Sun King cult that's like sort of Christianity, where like the Kims are like Jesus and they come down from heaven, and the 10 monolithic principles of North Korean ideology are this sort of replica of the 10 Commandments, and that North Korea is governed more like a sort of theocratic cult state rather than a Marxist dictatorship, which is actually kind of true. There is a whole debate about that, about like how much the North Koreans, how much Kim Il-sung sort of modeled the monarchy after Christianity. There's a big hot debate about that. I don't know. I'm kind of vague on that. I mean, my sense is that at least in the early years, in the first 20 years, it was basically Stalinism on steroids, right? You know, sort of you bring over the Stalinist model, right? Because we know the Soviets put Kim in power. Yeah. And then you just really turned up to 11, right? Yeah. Right? You like the,
I like the reference.
My reference, thanks to no, I grew up in the 80s, right? I remember Spinal Tap. You just turned up to 11 the personality cult. And then the personality cult kind of took on a life of its own and slowly graduated into, for lack of a better word, religion, where now the Kims are kind of like Jesus Christ. They're like half man, half divine. You have certain sacred places, just like you have sort of Mount Horeb in the Bible, and now you have Mount Paektu, right? You know, and you have sort of the star in heaven when Kim Jong-il is born. I mean, they are sort of like ripping off imagery, I guess, from Christianity. But I don't know if it's anything more than just pillaging some symbols. I don't know if you can actually like map out. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you can fully like map out like a real parallel. I don't know. I haven't actually thought it through, and I'm not sure anybody's written that up.
Well, I think what Matt may have been referencing is I know we heard we're at the Oslo Freedom Forum. Somebody mentioned that there are like the North Korean version of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, that's right. Tae Young-ho pushes that notion. He's the North Korean defector who's here, and he's emphasized that idea. It's an interesting interpretation. I don't reject it. It's just I just haven't really thought it through. But it should probably be researched more fully.
Okay.
But it's an interesting take, definitely.
Yeah. And now you have been in North Korea.
I have.
Correct?
That's correct.
What was it like?
To be honest, it's kind of what you expect, which is to say, you know that they're going to lie to you the whole time. You know it's going to be a Potemkin village. You know the whole thing is going to be a facade. You know you're not going to see the real North Korea. Every time you watch one of these docs that says, we're going to documentaries, we're going to reveal the real North Korea, that's not true. That's just not correct.
Yeah.
Right? The best you can get are some glimpses through the cracks of the facade, right? Which is to say, North Korea is such a mess that sometimes you just see stuff they don't want you to see because it's just a mess, right? So you can see a little bit as you go. But, I mean, in principle, the entire thing is completely stage managed the whole way. So in that sense, it's not surprising because you know they're going to give you this socialist paradise, flim-flam, which isn't true, right? And you're not going there to see the real North Korea because you're not going to get to see it. You're going there to see the song and dance of it. Does that make any sense? You're going there sort of in a second order sense, right? You're not going to actually see the real North Korea because you're not going to see it anyway, right? What you're going is to watch a Stalinist totalitarian Orwellian operation in operation, actually see them doing it, right? Because you can't see that anymore in the world, right? This is gone from every other country in the world. So for me as a political scientist, the fascinating thing about going to North Korea wasn't actually the country. It was watching them do the imagery, watching the performance.
It's almost like archaeological.
Yeah.
You're watching them fake
Yeah, exactly.
things.
Watching them fake their way through it and flim-flam their way through it and perform it and basically lie to you for 2 weeks. That in itself is actually really fascinating to watch.
What
Does that
was
make
the
any
most
sense?
interesting lie?
So the North Korean holy mountain is called Mount Paektu. It's up near the Chinese border. And in reality, when Kim Il-sung fought the Japanese during the colonial occupation period, he did it a little bit in Korea, then he fled into Manchuria and China, and then later on he went to the Soviet Union. And I mean, he did a little bit of fighting. There's a big debate about how much he did. I mean, he certainly did more than the founding fathers of South Korea, which is the big point of contention. But when you go to North Korea, they take you to Mount Paektu, and you see all these completely faked military bases and guerrilla bases and stuff like that. Well, here's where he led the revolution from it. It's all totally faked. I mean, they just built stuff on the mountainside and said, oh, these camps go back to the 20s or 30s, and it's from here that Kim Il-sung fought the Japanese all over the peninsula and eventually liberated the peninsula. And it's like, what? What are you talking? You know what I mean? It's like, and you can look at it. It's all got like nice, like shiny screws in it and stuff like that. Oh yeah, that screw was put in, 2 months ago to prop up this, load-bearing beam. I'm pretty sure that goes back all the way to 1926. I mean, they're just not even trying, right? You're just like, what am I doing here? But that's the whole point, right? The reason you're there is not to learn about the camp because it's flim-flam anyway, right? Mm-hmm. The reason there is to watch them lie to you in such extraordinary detail, to watch them build the facade through these extraordinarily elaborate lying performances. And that, again, as a political scientist, I find that really fascinating. And there's really nowhere left in the world that you can see that, right? I mean, that kind of totalitarianism is gone. The Soviet Union's gone. Eastern Europe is gone, right? China's post-Maoist, Vietnam, right? I mean, you really can't see that anywhere else in the world. So for me as a political scientist, it was actually really fascinating to go and watch a totalitarianism do totalitarianism. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Does that?
It does. And the people who are guiding you on this, is there any sense of like, okay, I'm lying to you, I know you know I'm lying to you, and like we're doing this, or are they just have they totally bought into it?
I would say that my guide, I don't want to get anybody in trouble here, so how can I say this? I would say that we had one person with us who was you could kind of tell that he or she was like rolling their eyes when some of the stuff was being but a lot of the other ones weren't. There was one person I can think of who kind of, I think, sent signals to us that was like, whatever.
Get me out of here.
Yeah. But most of the rest of them, it was hard to get a read.
I imagine they have to be very well trained at that point.
Yeah, and they got to be real cautious, right? Because they're being watched, there are minders everywhere and stuff like that. And so, my sense was they're going through the performance, kind of glassy-eyed. We're just going to do our shtick and make sure that when we talk to these foreigners, we don't do anything wrong that might get us in trouble because they're going to leave this facility in half an hour, and then after that, I have to explain to the guy from the party, why did I make a mistake and slip up or something like that, right? So not thinking about you. They're just sort of going through their song and dance and moving you along to your next place to make sure that, later they can report like how they did a good job in front of the foreigners.
But you have spoken critically of North Korea, so I'm like almost surprised that they would even allow you to go for this thing.
At the time I went, I don't think I'd quite accumulated the record that I have now.
This was before BBC Dad?
That's correct. I wouldn't go back now. And post Warm Beer, I would not recommend any Westerner go.
Yes.
To my mind, Warm Beer was basically murdered. The idea that somehow the North Koreans didn't realize that after this young man was in a coma for 8 months or 9 months or something, that he shouldn't be sent back to a real hospital for real care, and they just held on to him until 3 days before he died. I mean, to me, that's sort of like institutional murder, basically, through neglect, if you will. I think his family has every right to be absolutely livid. But yes, now as BBC Dad, and now that I have a pretty established record as a hawk on North Korea, not an ideological hawk, I would say, by the way, an empirical one, just to say that I think my hawkish beliefs on North Korea flow from North Korean behavior, not from some preset anti-communist ideology or something. Okay. But now, I wouldn't go back. My wife didn't know. I won't go back. It's too risky at this point.
Well, so we talked about the sort of cult of personality that they have going on in North Korea. I know China has seemingly for a long time wanted to implement a style of like kind of market reforms like they have in China. Right. Do you think there's any possibility of that happening?
You mean North Korea wants market reforms?
No, that China was kind of propping up Kim Jong-un, kind of seemingly wanting to implement some kind of change to North Korea.
Yeah, the Chinese have been telling the North Koreans going back to Kim Jong-il, back to, I think, the 1990s, the North Koreans have been saying, you should open up and lighten up a little bit. And
you can still be an authoritarian regime like China is.
Right, market Leninism or whatever we're supposed to call it. You guys tell me, you guys are the China experts, I don't know.
Socialism with Chinese characteristics.
There we go, excellent. So we're going to have socialism with North Korea. Socialism with gulags, right? That's what we're going to have. So capitalism with gulags or something. Wonderful. Capitalism with gulags. Outstanding. I think the North Koreans are... they're wary of that. The elites are real wary of that because the more North Korea becomes capitalist or market-oriented, the more that it looks economically like South Korea, the more the question is, why does North Korea exist separately from South Korea, right? I mean, the real problem for North Korea is that it has to stay the DPRK in order to explain why you don't have unification, right? If North Korea just becomes an authoritarian Northern Korea, right, then the question is, well, why don't you just go to the South and get the cash, right? North Korea has to stay really unique and really distinct in order to explain why it continues to exist despite this healthier, wealthier, nicer, more modern place to the South, right? And so the North Koreans need the ideology, they need the whole framework of Juche and Kimism and everything else to explain why they're different, right? So that's why South Korea has to be the Yankee colony and being manipulated by Japanese corporations and filled with foreigners who are, diluting the Korean race. I mean, the North Koreans have to go through all the song and dance because that suggests that North Korea really is the real North Korea, like we were talking about before, right? Without all that framework, even though nobody believes it, right? If you listen to Tae Yong-ho, he's like, no, nobody believes it anymore. They all know it's a bunch of bunk, right? But without it, you lose the ideological architecture that makes North Korea distinct, and then the question is, why does North Korea continue to exist, right? And this was East Germany's problem, right? Once you opened the wall and had an election, East Germany was just a poor version of West Germany, in which case just join West Germany for the cash, right? Which they did once socialism was debunked and out the window. And so North Korea has to hold on to this. That's why they have limits to how far they can really change, because real political change is an existential threat to the sovereignty of the weaker of the two Korean states. Does that make any sense? Right? And so there's a limit to how far they can go. So that's why you don't get the Chinese style marketization. That's my guess. And as long as the Chinese will want to pay the North Korean elite's bills, right, then the elite, which doesn't really care very much about its population, right, they let 2 million of them starve to death in the 1990s. They don't really need to change. Right? I mean, the North Korean elite doesn't really care if its own people starve as long as they're doing okay, right? North Korea's kind of like a gangster state, right? Then you don't really need to listen to the Chinese because, if your own people are dropping dead in the street because you didn't have enough food, I mean, you don't care.
Because China continues to support them regardless.
So what are the ways in which China is propping up North Korea?
Well, we know that the Chinese allow the North Koreans to put money in sort of Chinese banks, right? The Chinese regularly give North Korea energy assistance. The North Koreans provide a lot of, the Chinese provide a lot of diplomatic cover at the UN on things like human rights and sanctions and stuff like that. And the Chinese have to be sort of pushed, kicking and screaming into sanctions at the panel of experts at the UN level, right? The Chinese always sort of show up late and don't turn in their reports on time and don't fill them out completely and stuff like that. You hear lots and lots of complaints about that.
It's like the 10-year-old homework excuse version
Something
of
like that,
trying
yeah.
to, like,
And and then the Chinese kind of looked the other way for a while on a lot of North Korea's sort of criminal behavior, right? So like the Chinese looked the other way on North Korea's meth trafficking until it began to spread into China, and then the Chinese really sort of clamped down on it really hard. You've heard the story.
But North Korea is still spreading meth through their embassies in other countries.
Yeah, the North Koreans are still big into like fake cigarettes and the drug trade and insurance fraud. The North Koreans do a lot of gangsterism, which is why I would actually argue North Korea is more like a gangster state than a Marxist state, right? North Korea is like what would happen if the Corleone family from the Godfather films took over a whole country, right? And they basically shake down their own people and the international community so they can live this high life of jet skis and girls and flat screen TVs and summer residences at Wonsan and all that kind of stuff, right? It's like it's a gangster state on top of this Orwellian pseudo-Marxist whatever at the bottom, right? It's
A lot of interesting adjectives to throw at it.
Yeah, well, okay. In my writing, the term that I use is North Korea. I call it an Orwellian gangster fiefdom, right? It's an Orwellian
Fiefdom?
gangster fiefdom, right? That is to say that it's the structure of state surveillance is ripped straight from Stalinism, and it's like arguably as bad as 1984, right? The government at the top is basically a family gangster racket, right? In which they rip off their own people, right? And they rip off donors and the international community, right? Are people about to starve? You should give us a bunch of aid. We give them the aid, and then they divert half of it to the army, so the army doesn't try to overthrow them. Right? This is why there's a huge debate about whether or not we should give aid to the North Koreans, because they always want it without strings, because they're going to divert half of it to the military to keep the military happy, or they're going to resell it on the market and give the cash to the military, or buy Xboxes with it for elites, right? And then it's a fiefdom because it's basically run like a medieval, personalized little space, right? I mean, everybody's sort of seen that really famous image of North Korea at night, right? Where like the whole country's black except for the capital city, right? And that's kind of like the Ottoman Empire, right? Like or like the Roman Empire, right? All roads lead to Rome, right? So all resources flow into the middle, right? Where like the great potentates live, right? And they basically leech out from the rest of the country. It's run like a fiefdom, right? The big chief lives in the manor and he basically bleeds the peasants white. Right, and it's because the North Korean state doesn't do things that states do. The North Korean state doesn't like build roads, right? There's like 1,000 miles of paved road in all of North Korea. Wow. The North Korean state doesn't feed its own people, right? The North Korean state doesn't do normally things that states do because the North Korean state's really badly atrophied because what really matters is the Kim monarchy, right? So I think it's a fair interpretation to say that you've got a mix of sort of the Orwellian structure, which hasn't gone away, of state control, right? You've got gangsterism, right? All this fraud and drug running and all this other stuff. Gold smuggling, slavery, right? People trafficking, all this stuff, right? The North Koreans are great at that. They've been doing it for 40 years, right? And that's all Godfather stuff, right? Yeah. And then at the top, it's basically run like a feudal clique, right? I mean, it's a monarchy, right? And it's like something out of the 18th century, right? It's all sort of like cronies and buddies and friends and I knew this guy, and this guy's dad fought with my dad back against the Japanese. It's all sort of this interrelated personalistic stuff, and that's feudalism. So it's like a fiefdom, right? I mean, when you go to North Korea, they don't even call it North Korea very often. They don't even call it the DPRK very often. They call it Kim country. Gimnara. Really? They do. They call it Gimnara, which is literally, that's a fiefdom, right? It's like the country of the Kims, right? It's like Saudi Arabia. It's like the Arabia of the Saud family, right? That's what North Korea is. It's Kim country. That's what I mean. It's not Korea at all. It's like Jesus land or something, right? Where like Kim Il-sung is Jesus Christ, half alive, right? He's half man, he's half divine, right? He's dead, but he's not really dead because his picture is everywhere, his statue is everywhere. He's in the Constitution as the eternal president. He's everywhere. He's made reference to at all times, right? So the best analogy, this is what I've said in my writing, he's like Jesus Christ. He's half man, half divine. Even though he's died, he's not really dead, right? And so it's like this sort of like cult at the top, which is sort of pushed down onto the rest of the country via this police state. I know, it's like a horrible mishmash, right?
Yeah.
It's
like the worst of everything.
It's really, really hard. The important thing is that it's not Marxist in any way, right? People shouldn't really call it communist anymore or anything like that, right? So.
I mean, I don't know. The gulags still seem kind of familiar.
Yeah.
I
I do think Marx would be kind of proud.
Of North Korea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, it's
I mean, they took down the pictures of Marx and Lenin from Kim Il-sung Square. Like
you
10
just
years
need
ago.
the one guy, right? I mean, this is kind of a tangent, but what did you think of the movie The Interview? Was that at all accurate?
Oh no! I mean,
The ending,
that
maybe
was
not
just-
so
that was
much.
just
Well,
a lark.
obviously.
that was just a silly lark. I mean,
Yeah.
it was fun. I mean, there's always like I've written about this too. There's sort of like a moral question about whether or not we should laugh about North Korea, right? Because I mean, it's like the worst country in the world, right? It's like worse than ISIS, worse than the Taliban, right? Human Rights Watch used to say it was worse than Talibanic Afghanistan in the 1990s.
Wow.
It was always at the bottom, right? So there's a question about whether or not you should actually laugh about it, right? So on the one hand, I mean, North Korea is sort of really outrageous and ridiculous, right? People talk about like socialist haircuts, and Kim Jong-Un or Kim Jong-il used to wear platform shoes, and and like there's like there are websites devoted to the traffic police in North Korea.
Yes, I've seen
they're like
those.
Stalinist
Yeah.
sex symbols.
Yeah, because
right?
they're like women who stand
Right.
in the middle of the square,
And
like directing traffic.
They attract
Yeah.
they recruit very beautiful ones apparently, like on purpose, and so they're like Stalinist sex symbols. There are like websites about them. I know it's totally ridiculous, and so there's this big debate about whether or not you should laugh about that because it's actually really kind of funny. But then it's also you're like laughing about people living in the slave state. So it's,
The one thing that I have a friend whose family fled North Korea, and we were working together at an ad agency, and like somebody else was like using kind of the communist like style, like the Mao Cultural Revolution, Kim Il Sung style of art,
Okay.
as like inspiration for like some kind of like advertising campaign, and both of us were just like so pissed about it
creepy.
because we're like, it just seems kitschy to people. Like
Yeah.
people are attracted to that like kitsch, but like, it's just like nobody
isn't
knows.
that popular in China, right? Isn't like Maoist kitsch like popular in China? Haven't I read that?
I've heard
It
there's a
still
nostalgia
is,
for the
yeah.
Cultural
I
Revolution.
mean, I remember when I went to China, you could buy like the Little Red Book. Like I remember reading the Little Red Book in high school as training. It's like the communists are coming to get us. I was born in the 70s. Communists are coming to get us. I went to Catholic school, and they're going to try to destroy the Catholic Church. So we have to read Marx and we have to read Mao to understand how these people are going to try to destroy us, right? Like I remember reading it as like know your enemy kind of stuff.
I mean, the
and
last
then
time
when
I
I
was
went
in-
to then when I went to Beijing after I went through the Mao Mausoleum, they're like selling it as
Oh, yeah.
You can buy the
You
watches
buy the little hat?
and that, yeah.
Oh my God! It's like what the hell?
Mao T-shirts and
I
stuff.
It's
mean-
become a souvenir shop.
Yeah, I know. At the end of the mausoleum, it's like a souvenir shop. It's like
If only Mao could see this, he would roll over at his
he
mausoleum.
certainly would.
Well, I think, in rural parts of China, like, there are statues of Mao in, like, the same kind of places that sell statues of, like, Chinese kitchen gods and stuff like that. Like, he's become this
He's
weird...
just another one of the household gods.
It's very strange. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, like, you mentioned, like, how in the West it's kind of like kitschy to do the communist thing. Like, even the extreme Nazi fascist stuff, like, there was an element of that in, like, rock and roll in the 70s. Like, even, like, David Bowie had this whole, like, kind of fascination with this
Nazi
like, fascism.
kitsch.
Yeah, it's weird
No,
how...
Nazi chic, isn't that what it was called?
I
Nazi
don't know.
chic.
I was born in the last...
You see Nazi chic in Asia too.
Like
Thailand, yeah.
Yeah, I see that in Korea, sometimes like Nazi bars and stuff, and people wearing SS style uniforms. And
Wow,
it's really
okay,
weird.
that's something
look that
that's-
up. Yeah, look that
Yeah,
up.
Thailand's really extreme. Yeah, it's a weird reaction to what, objectively should be seen as like some of the worst stuff humanity has produced. So we're in a very
They have
fun
great
moment.
uniforms. That's...
It's visually striking.
Yeah.
There's that
That's
to
what the
say.
South Korean rock bands always say when they get caught wearing Nazi militaria.
The irony. Well, okay, so one question I have is, obviously the situation with North Korea has changed a lot over the past year. And Trump and Kim, they kind of suck all the air out of the room. But, in these negotiations, South Korea must be playing some kind of role. It's not just Trump and Kim.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, the South Koreans actually have a term for this. They call it Korea passing, the idea that South Korea actually has been sort of sidelined, right? Which is what your question is pushing towards. And there has been a sort of debate inside South Korea, like what's South Korea's role? The North Koreans don't want to talk to South Korea, right? The North Koreans want to talk to the big kahuna, right? Which is, again, sort of the way North Korea is structured, right? The big boss is all that really matters. Again,
Is
it's a
the
gangster.
big boss Trump?
The big
or
boss
boss
is
Xi
Trump.
Jinping?
The big boss is Trump, right? The Americans are the ones who have the ability to offer North Korea a really, really big, juicy deal. The Americans are the ones who, if they were to withdraw from Korea, would radically change the balance on the peninsula and stuff like that. The Americans are the ones who can move the Security Council and sanctions and stuff like that, right? So they want to talk to the big boss. It also makes sense within the framework of North Korean ideology that you don't talk to the South Koreans because they're the Yankee colony, right? South Korea is not a real country, right? South Korea was set up by Japanese fascist collaborators, right? And was dominated by Japanese corporations and Japanese money, right? Is the Yankee colony, right? Is filled with, non-Korean, racially non-Korean peoples, white people, black people, whatever, running around, getting married and meeting Koreans and having mixed race kids. And all this is sort of like the dilution of the Korean race and stuff like that. So South Korea is like this puppet, right? And so you don't talk to the puppet leader because he's being manipulated by the real
Talk
leader.
to the puppet master.
Right, and that's the American president. And that's why the North Koreans have been looking to talk to American presidents since, gosh, I don't know, the 80s. Right? That's why it was such a big deal when Trump went, because, we never did that before because you're granting prestige to North Korea when they get to meet POTUS. And so, Trump kind of threw that out the window. But, but talking to South Koreans, no, that's the real story is Trump. So that's what they want.
And sorry, go ahead. I was just wondering, do you have any sense of how China has felt about that?
My sense broadly is that China has been a silent partner in all this. I mean, you don't hear the Chinese saying too much about this, I think in part because the Chinese want the North Koreans and the Americans to talk, right? We know that China doesn't want North Korea to collapse, but we know that China is uncomfortable with North Korea with having nuclear weapons like the rest of us are, right? We know that China doesn't want a war in the region, and we know that China would like some kind of modus vivendi between the Americans and the North Koreans that would stabilize the situation, right? But keep North Korea around and keep the Americans pinned down up here. Right, so that we're not worrying about the South China Sea, right? I mean, as long as North Korea is running around making trouble, right, the Americans can't put all their resources and aid into the South China Sea, right? So if you're North Korea, you want to keep North Korea. If you're China, you want to keep North Korea around, but you don't want North Korea making meth and selling to your people and smuggling nuclear weapons through your territory
and maybe
sponsoring
actually testing nuclear weapons.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Right. You
China.
don't want doing like above ground nuclear tests, right?
Yeah.
So you want to keep the crazy but bottle it. Right, so if you're China, it's tough, right? You're like walking between the raindrops with the North, and the North is a tough customer, right? And we know that the North is aware of all this and doesn't and really resents Chinese control and manipulation, right? That's why the North Koreans are always shopping around for a deal with us, the UN, the Japanese, because they're looking for alternate sources of funding, right? So they can de-link somewhat from China, so they're not as dependent on the Chinese aid we were talking about, right? The more China is the only umbilical keeping North Korea afloat, the more China can push certain policies on North Korea, right?
Go ahead.
Well,
anyway, so did you want me to finish? Or?
Go ahead.
Okay. So anyway, so if you're China, I think what you really want is to sort of like thread that needle, right? And the best way to do that is get the North Koreans talking to the Americans so that the situation stabilizes and doesn't tip into either a conflict, right, or North Korean implosion or something like that, right? And so I think that's why the Chinese haven't said really very much at all actually about this, because they're quite comfortable pushing both the Americans and the North Koreans to talk to try to find some kind of arrangement. I think that suits China's strategic purposes, and they've been quite quiet, quietly pushing a little bit, right? Kim went to meet Xi 3 times in like 3 months or something like that.
Which was the first they had never met.
Right, and then all of a sudden in the middle of 2018, they met like 3 times in 2 months or something like that, right? And I think that I'm pretty sure that was Xi telling, Kim, go, or we're really going to turn the screws and like shut off the gas, right? And so I think the Chinese are just kind of stepping back and sort of pushing all sides to like some kind of.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, the relationship between Xi and the Kim family, because the Kim family had always been supported by, in short, a political faction that was sort of a rival to Xi Jinping. And so I think that was a big reason why when Xi Jinping came to power, there was no contact between Kim Jong-Un and Xi Jinping. And then suddenly the political situation changed, that they could start to have a bit of a dialogue. I know you wanted to.
So what were you going to say? Sorry.
I was just going to say, do you think that North Korea is getting more or less dependent on China?
Less. There's a lot of, again, you guys tell me, you guys maybe know better than I do. There's a lot of rumors about how Treasury sanctions are biting on Chinese banks, and so the North Koreans are starting to route their money through Russian banks, which are under sanction anyway, and don't care the Russians do business with anybody because Russia's a gangster state too. The Americans are certainly paying attention more, but I don't have a sense that it's getting worse. I think the big issue is North Korea's energy vulnerability, right? I mean, North Korea can't. That's one of the reasons they want nuclear power, also, right? Because then they're not as dependent on carbon coming through China, right? I mean, they don't have carbon, right? I mean, and that's why they're always selling coal through China, because they're desperate for gasoline, quite honestly. But no, I don't have a sense that it's become dramatically worse. No, I mean, they're stuck with China. But I think that the real story is they don't want to only have one donor because then that donor gets asymmetric leverage, right? So you want to have multiple donors, right? And I think now that North Korea has the nuclear weapons and they're safe behind that, they're safe behind that shield, right? Now they can start talking to everybody, right? You got the nuclear shields, the Americans want to attack. Okay, now let's go talk. So we'll talk to the Chinese, we'll talk to the Japanese, we'll talk to the Americans and the South Koreans, and you're basically shopping for a deal, right? You're looking for a deal. All right, I'll give you a couple of nuclear weapons maybe, or I'll give you some warheads, or I'll give up some launchers or something, and what are you going to give me? Right? Are you going to give me a permanent aid package? Are you going to give me recognition? Are you going to give me investment? Or whatever. I mean, Kim Jong-Un, now that he's got the nukes, right? Hold on to, I don't know, most of them, 50 or 60 warheads, and you sell the other ones for cash or aid or recognition or something like that. It's actually pretty smart. I think that's what he's doing. He's shopping around looking for a deal. He won't give up all the weapons, but he might be willing to give up some of them if we give him something really big and juicy. And the whole purpose of that is to be more independent and less dependent on foreigners, most obviously China, but also everybody else, right? I mean, ideally, you'd be independent, right? North Korea's economy doesn't work, and autarky in North Korea is total failure, so they are dependent. But if they can get some kind of regular aid flows in, that allows them to act with greater impunity and not be so dependent on, Xi Jinping yelling at them or something like that. And I think that's the story, is to regain freedom of movement that North Korea's depressed, dysfunctional economy doesn't allow. Does that make any sense?
I mean, they barely have an economy. I have the impression that a lot of it is just like the black market that's keeping people.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, then Kim Jong-Un has really prioritized this, right? I mean, Kim Jong-Un has really emphasized internal growth. That's another one of the other reasons a lot of people think that they've gone so hard for the nuclear weapons, is because once you have them, you don't need this gigantic conventional military, right? So maybe you can actually start to shorten the terms of conscript servicemen, right? You can sort of, right now I think they serve 10 years, maybe you can have them serve 7 or something like that, right? Maybe you don't need to buy as many, bullets and tanks and APCs and stuff like that, right? And that's an interesting question. It'll be curious to see in the next 10 years if the KPA, the North Korean People's Army, actually retrenches a little bit or shrinks a little bit, because now that you have the nukes, maybe you don't need 1.4 million men under arms, right? I mean, it's an enormous military. It's a huge burden on this tiny economy, right? So maybe nuclear weapons will give you a little bit of space to sort of roll back the brass out of the economy.
Yeah. Would that be a risk at all to turn these former military people kind of loose onto the population?
Well, presumably it would be done gradually, right? And you could sort of start shrinking conscription terms, for example, I think would be the most obvious thing, right? Is to sort of reduce them from 10 years to 9. And then North Korea is already flooded with people who know how to use weapons, right? Everybody goes to the military, including females, the entire country. You can turn out something like, 8 million reservists or something, right? I mean, North Korea is basically designed to fight a massive ground battle against the Americans, right? Like Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, you just flood the battlefield with people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the standing military is 1.3 or 0.4, something like that, and you got 7 or 8 million reservists, and they're all trained, right? They all know how to use a weapon from back when they were in the army, and so there's a huge burden, and so maybe the nukes gives you a way to reduce that.
Funnel the resources elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And then again, if you can do that, then you're not as dependent on foreigners, most obviously China, but again, everybody else. Right?
Is there any kind of, danger for North Korea with the border with China becoming more porous, more things coming in from China, more people leaving?
Yeah, I think the North Korean state has basically given up on its ability to provide the minimum caloric needs of its people, right? Which I think is 1,800 calories a day, right? According to the WHO, isn't that what it is?
I think I heard it was 1,400, where it's enough for an average woman, a smaller woman.
So the North Koreans can't make those targets, right? And so the choice is either mass famine resulting in the possibility of public disturbances and riots,
I thought it was America where people were starving.
Right, yeah, our friend there. Right, but the problem with the famine, of course, is not that, if you're the North Korean elite, the problem with the famine isn't that people are dying because you don't care about the people, right? The problem is they might become so desperate they actually engage in political action, right? Bread riots that spin out of control and everything else. So you want to make sure that your people are somewhat fed so they don't revolt. Not because you care about them, but because you care about keeping them quiescent. And if the state can't do it, then getting resources through China is the second best alternative, right? So ideally you'd be able to do it yourself. If not, all these illicit networks with China. That's why the state kind of looks the other way, right? Because those keep the North Korean people from tipping back into food insecurity, much less famine. And so I think the state has just kind of decided to look the other way on that. Occasionally it intervenes and sort of like beats down on the small markets, and they send out the police to like yell at people for growing plots that are too large and stuff like that, right? You sort of you engage in kind of occasional punishment, right?
There was
of people, but you don't actually overthrow the market system, the sort of small market system at the bottom, because if you did, then you're back in the late 1990s. So, and that's why the markets are sort of there. And the real trick is whether or not you can manage this kind of corrupt, cronyist, small-scale capitalism bubbling up from below. Can you keep that from turning into something more substantial, like real challenges to the state? So far, they seem to be doing a pretty good job.
There was a crazy story I read the other day in a women's magazine about it was Refinery 29, which is a women's website, about how North Korean women were being arrested for smuggling in cosmetics from China.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, like I said, there are occasional crackdowns on the markets and stuff, which is presumably to occasionally reassert the authority of the state. But again, you don't want the hand to be too heavy, because those markets are actually doing something also for the state as well, right? And that's the interesting balance. And again, that's why economic growth is important. That's why maybe getting an aid package for the nuclear weapons are important, right? And the more you have other resources, the less you have to deal with the markets at home, with the Chinese and so on.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious. I know that the South Korea has been, like, they would love reunification. How much of that do you think is sort of like the government eyeing those nuclear weapons? Like, maybe they wouldn't mind so much if those were South Korea's nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
as well.
I've actually written about this. I think it's unlikely that I would say there's a 50% chance. Unlikely is probably the wrong word. I would say there's probably a 50% chance that a unified Republic of Korea, right? If North Korea falls apart, South Korea absorbs North Korea. I'd say there's probably a 50% chance that South Koreans will keep the nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are extremely valuable for regime defense, for deterrence against foreign threats. South Korea is surrounded by much larger countries that have intervened in its politics for many years. South Korea does not want to get sucked into some cataclysmic conflict between the Americans and the Chinese that might also suck in the Japanese and the Russians, right? I mean, that could be World War IV potentially. You know,
4? Just skip 3?
Oh, pardon me. Sorry. I teach terrorism. I teach terrorism where I teach like neoconservatives saying the war on terrorism is World War III. My apologies. Sorry. So World War III, whatever. Sorry. Too many conferences, too many panels. Right. So the World War III. Sorry. Right. So if you're the South Koreans, right, you want to stay out of all that. Right. You know, if the Americans and Chinese and Japanese and Russians want to destroy themselves in World War III and there's nukes flying, oh my God, you don't want to be involved in that. Right? So what's the best way to keep these countries, all of which are right on top of you, right? You're a little Korea, there are all these countries right on top of you. It's really easy for them to violate your airspace, your territorial integrity, right? And so what's the best way to do that? Well, nuclear weapons is a pretty awesome way to do that, right? So I think there are powerful structural incentives in South Korea's geopolitics and in Korea's regional geopolitics. I think they're really powerful incentives actually to keep the nukes.
That would be so ironic if the peace and security of South Korea becomes dependent on former North Korean nuclear missiles. Like, who would have seen that coming?
Yeah, South Korean conservatives, I think, will be willing to swap North Korea's nuclear weapons for a permanent American security guarantee that involved U.S. bases throughout the peninsula. Right. So if you have completely Southern-led unification with no Chinese constraints on it whatsoever, North Korea just disappears tomorrow. South Korea just absorbs North Korea completely, and the American alliance stays in place, and the Americans can deploy anywhere they want in North Korea and the rest of it, and the Chinese have no say, then I think South Korean conservatives might be willing to give up the nuclear weapons. But, you know, most people think that some kind of unification scenario is going to involve significant Chinese constraints, right? That the U.S. military will have to leave in exchange for China cutting off North Korea. Or the U.S. military won't be able to move north of the current DMZ, right? Supposedly this is what Gorbachev told Jim Baker when Gorbachev gave up East Germany, right? That he could have East Germany, but NATO couldn't be deployed into Eastern Germany, right? Now, Baker says that didn't happen, but the point is that, you know, that was sort of a deal that the Soviets were looking for, and I would imagine the Chinese are going to push for something along those lines, and China, of course, is in a much better position than the Soviets were to push for a deal, right? The Soviet Union was collapsing, it was desperate, China's rising, right? So China can push pretty hard to have its interests respected in any kind of final Korean resolution.
Do you think the Chinese Communist Party would prefer to have a nuclear-armed Korean peninsula led by the South, or a South Korea that is, you know, completely infested with Americans all the way up to the Chinese border? Because it might just be one of those two options.
That's actually a really good question. If I were China, I would be, if my choice was a unified Republic of Korea allied to the Americans or a nuclear armed independent Korea, like a neutralist Korea with nuclear weapons, I would take the neutralist one.
I mean, you are between an ROK and a hard place.
Ooh.
I'm sorry.
That's a little geopolitical joke for you.
But there is a model for this, right? I mean, places, Switzerland is an obvious model, right? I mean, Switzerland is very mountainous. It's surrounded by countries that are much, much larger than it, and Switzerland's answer has been strict neutrality and to be armed to the teeth. Right? A lot of people don't know this about Switzerland, but they got like conscription and they got like military bases carved into mountains. I mean, Switzerland is actually.
And they've got those little knives everywhere.
But it's armed neutrality, right? It's armed neutralism, right? And South Korea could do the same thing. You could hold on to the nuclear weapons, right? Keep the large military and basically say, okay, we're peaceful, just stay away from us. So if you Americans and Chinese want to nuke each other over the Spratlys, fine, we're not doing this with you, right? No, but that's actually, if you're South Korea, that's actually not a bad outcome, right? Because the last thing you want to do is get chain ganged into a war between four great powers that could potentially involve nuclear weapons, right? I mean, China, Russia, the United States, and Japan are all right on Korea's doorstep, right? I mean, it's just brutal. I mean, geopolitically, that's just a brutal environment. And so nuclear weapons are really valuable to help keep those massive pressures at bay.
Have they considered moving to the South Pacific?
See, that's what I always say to Koreans. It's like if you guys were located like off the coast of South Africa or something like that, nobody would care. You could be like New Zealand, right? New Zealand's out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody cares. So you don't have to have a military.
Cares.
Right?
You could just build some islands somewhere in the middle of the Pacific.
That's what the Chinese do.
Well, I think this is a good time to sort of transition more to South Korea because you're an expert on both North and South Korea. We don't want North Korea to hog all the show.
Okay.
What's your sense of how South Koreans feel about U.S. presence?
Well, there was a poll a couple years ago that said that 95% of South Koreans support the American alliance and say that it's necessary. This has been a constraint on the current liberal government because the liberal government wants to sort of do a lot of things with North Korea that the Americans don't like, and the government really can't do that because the government can't strain relations with the American government too much without the South Korean public pushing back. And the Americans have been pretty uncomfortable with Moon's outreach efforts. So they really don't want the South Koreans going into North Korea and providing all kinds of aid and stuff like that unless we get some movement on the strategic issues.
Because that aid then gets funneled to Kim and the military
that's the argument that we make, right? And the South Korean argument is, well, this aid would convince the North Koreans that we're different and times have changed. They don't need to have this gigantic military. And
we're kinder, friendlier.
Right, exactly, right? that we're not this sort of hawkish state anymore. We're not a revisionist South Korea anymore looking to destroy North Korea. We're trying to get along. A new era of peace is the way the Moon government defines it, right? But Moon can't really run along with that very far because the Americans keep pulling him back, right? The Americans won't compromise in the sanctions regime without more movement from the North Koreans. The Americans don't like the idea of military concessions along the sea border, the Northern Limit Line, the NLL, and along the DMZ. The Americans have been real uncomfortable with those kinds of things. So there's a lot of bureaucratic resistance on the American side. And Moon just can't afford to pick a huge fight with the Americans. Because every time he does, the South Korean conservative papers are like, what are you doing? The Americans are our friends, and they've kept us secure for 70 years. And, if the Americans get really upset and they leave, South Korea's defense budget will, quadruple. I mean, there are a lot of, the South Koreans get good benefits from the American defense guarantee, right? You get a world-class defense guarantee, which is pretty fantastic. And then also you don't have to spend as much on defense because the Americans provide a lot of assets. Right? I mean, South Korea's defense budget would probably double or triple, well, probably triple or even quadruple if we weren't around, right? And so Moon is just stuck, right? He's stuck between a left liberal bloc that elected him that really wants deep engagement with North Korea. They really want it, and they really want the Americans to get out of the way, right? The Americans are sort of interlopers who are disrupting this process, and this is a Korean process. You should get the hell out of the way. The problem is that South Koreans are allied to the United States, right? And so you can't just move the Americans out of the way. You can break the alliance, but if you do that, the South Korean public's going to go nuts, right? And so Moon is stuck, and that's why you get this kind of back and forth game where Moon tries to do some stuff with North Korea. The Americans yell, and he pulls back, and he does a little bit of this. The Americans yell, and he does a little bit of that. I mean, there's been this constant back and forth by the Moon government testing the sanctions regime, trying to get it rolled back, trying to recruit countries to tell the Americans not to do it. So Moon went off to Europe about 6 months ago trying to get European support for sanctions relief. They all said no. I understand what Moon is trying to do. The problem is that in the West, particularly in the United States, but in the West, there's an enormous amount of suspicion of North Korea, particularly after the Human Rights Report from the UN on North Korea about 4 or 5 years ago that definitively established that North Korea is just the worst country in the world on human rights. It's just really, really hard for Western democracies to compromise on this kind of stuff without the North Koreans giving us more. And Moon is just stuck. He just doesn't know how to get past that, right? And I think his détente agenda has really been crippled by the American unwillingness to go along with it because the North Koreans aren't giving us anything.
When you say they want deep engagement with North Korea, what does that mean?
That means reopening the Kaesong Industrial Zone. That means reopening tours at Mount Diamond. That means South Korean investment in North Korea, possibly business investment. That means setting up even North Korean bonds, like a capital market in North Korea. I was reading about that the other day. I know that's just totally insane. Buying North Korean bonds,
It's a good investment.
man, you put your money in that, man.
That and Bitcoin.
It's a total swindle.
No, Bitcoin seems
Getting
more
the
stable.
North Korean, yeah,
True.
But getting North Korea into international financial institutions is another idea that's been kicked around. A peace treaty to end the war, an embassy. I mean, the North Korean left, the South Korean left has been thinking about this stuff for a long time. There's a long list of things that the South Korean left has proposed to sort of improve inter-Korean cooperation, right? But as North Korea has nuclearized and missilized the sanctions regime, the international sanctions regime, of which South Korea is a part and obligated as a member of the UN, the sanctions regime has gotten tougher and tougher and tougher. And so engaging North Korea has become harder and harder because you keep colliding with that sanctions wall. And the South Korean left really kind of resents that because they see it as like foreign intervention in what's really a Korean affair, right? And so the idea is there should be like an ethnic exemption for South Korea, right? They're a part of the Minjok also. We should be able to talk to them. You're just a bunch of foreigners. What the hell are you doing here? This is a Korean thing. Let us do it, right? And so the South Korean left basically wants the South Korean president just ignore the UN sanctions, just do it anyway, right? And that's tough because then you really collide with the Americans and the democratic partners that South Korea has. And the South Korean right really wants those relationships. The South Korean right really wants South Korea rooted in a larger community of democracies, including Japan, the Americans, and the Europeans. The South Korean left is much more nationalistic and is kind of distrustful of that, right? They see the American presence during the Cold War as manipulating South Korean politics. They don't like Japan at all as the former occupying power, right? And the South Korean left is much more comfortable breaking away from the larger democratic community and being a Korean power negotiating directly with the other Korean state, and if necessary, China, right? And so that's why you get this really sharp, deep polarization in South Korea. The South Korean right is very traditional, sort of anti-communist, hawkish, whatever, right? The South Korean left is much more sort of like nationalistic and wants to pursue a kind of Koreanized solution to this where the foreigners don't really participate. And that's just not possible as long as you've got the Americans running around and the South Korean left just doesn't know what to do. And the obvious solution is to throw the Americans out. But if you do that, the South Korean left will lose the election immediately. South Korean public just doesn't want that, right?
Yeah.
Well, what is the end game for the South Korean left? Like, if they got to do whatever they want to do, would they match?
To convince the Americans that North Korea is moving enough to get the Americans to lighten up on the sanctions regime so that South Korea can pursue a kind of broad front, full court press engagement with the North.
So if they get that kind of engagement, if there's investment in the North, what happens? The North opens up more?
Ideally, North Korea, the North Korean elite sees that the Americans and the South Koreans are no longer revisionists, seeking the dissolution of the DPRK and are willing to live with it in its current form. And then the DPRK will be less paranoid and can disarm and doesn't need nuclear weapons as much. And then you're going to get some kind of inter-Korean federation or something like that where the two Koreas will kind of grow together slowly over time.
But as you said earlier, the North Korean identity is so much dependent on...
That's right.
That, so would that be even possible?
I don't think so.
I mean, also, if you merge like a democracy in an authoritarian state, like the average of that is still going to be pretty authoritarian.
So that's what would probably happen, right? The two of them, you would have like a two-pillar solution, right? It's like, what is it? One country, two systems or something, right? It's like China.
Which works out great.
Yeah, I know. It works so well in Macau and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
The Taiwanese are so excited to join up.
Yeah. We heard someone say there'll be one country. No. What was it?
Oh, two country, one system, where they're going to try to subvert Taiwan.
Yeah. Whenever I go to Taiwan, I hear that. Yeah. So that would be the idea. And what you would have is like this very thin covering federation on the top, right? And these two basically sort of like separate pillars, right, with this one. The problem with that is that basically the North Koreans would treat that covering federation as a transfer mechanism, right? Basically, they would expect South Korea to pay their bills indefinitely, right? This is the gangster part, right? You know, it's better to get permanent aid from South Korea as a fellow Korean people than having to go to talk to these foreigners.
They have the nuclear weapons. They can provide protection to South Korea.
And so that's if you're North Korea, that's great. The South Korean left has flirted with this idea of a confederation for a while, but I mean, it raises these problems that you brought up, right? Is that what would it look like to have a totalitarian Sun King cult monarchy next to a modern democracy? Nobody
Odd
knows
Couple.
what that would even look like.
It would be like the Odd Couple.
And I have no idea. So that's
Just
why
make it into a reality show, and then they can all raise money that way.
Oh,
So that's why whenever I talk about this, I'm like, the covering federation is going to be paper thin, right? And basically, it's going to be a way for the North Koreans to ask the South Koreans for money.
Yeah. How does the Korean left like deal with that? Like how that seemed like unbelievable that they think like this would actually work.
I bring that question up a lot with the doves and liberals I know in Korea, and I never get really good answers on that. I'm extraordinarily skeptical that anything like this might work. I mean, the usual argument is that if we engage North Korea, and this is what I hear from my friends on this stuff, if we engage North Korea enough, we convince them that we're not hostile, right? The North Koreans always say the Americans pursue a hostile policy, right? So if we can convince them that we're not hostile, the Americans are no longer hostile, we all want to be friends, we accept North Korea, we don't have revisionist intentions on North Korea anymore, we don't want to dissolve or eliminate North Korea anymore, we're not going to try to overthrow the cult, right? We're not going to try to overthrow the leadership, right? And we can convince North Korea to be less paranoid, less terrified of the rest of the world, then North Korea will lighten up internally, right? The camps maybe will close, right? The North Koreans won't need nuclear weapons anymore. If we're all friends, the North Koreans don't need nuclear weapons anymore, right?
Okay. Kind of like how if you invest in China, China becomes a democracy, which it did, and there's no problems.
Yeah, that's just like so much faith in like the goodwill or like honest intentions of North Korea. That's mind blowing.
I mean, maybe Dennis Rodman can solve this problem.
He's the first American ambassador to North Korea. That's what I've heard. Trump was going to nominate him when we recognize North Korea. I want to go work for him in Trump Tower, Pyongyang. You know, he'll have the presidential suite up top. It'll be all gold leaf. Me and Rodman will go up there and what is it? Smoke pot for Bitcoin, potcoin or whatever. Potcoin. We'll go up there and get high for potcoin
And watch the world burn as World War IV comes down.
Exactly.
Oh
We watch
my
the
God.
Chinese and American nuclear weapons fly overhead.
Just overhead.
World War III.
Well, so let's talk about how the U.S. Presence in South Korea affects South Korea and China's relationship.
Okay.
When the U.S. built the THAAD missile defense system, that caused a lot of issues in China, and China targeted South Korean companies in China. So where does that factor in?
Again, with the South Korean right doesn't care. South Korean right, I think, is comfortable with some delinkage from China in the interest of national security, right? I mean, this is the same kind of thing you see in the United States now, right, with the trade war, right? Is that maybe we need this trade war because we just shouldn't be so tied up with China because they're a rising competitor for American power, and so the trade war has a strategic logic, which is that we should actually start to decouple from China because China is now a competitor, and we shouldn't actually be putting money into the economy. I think the South Korean right is pretty comfortable with that and strongly supported that, and that was that, right? South Korea is an American ally, right? THAAD is important. China is an opponent. North Korea is an opponent. Case closed. It's pretty simple. Again, on the South Korean left, it's more of a mixed bag, right? As what is it, like a week after the South Korean government agreed to put in THAAD or something, like a whole bunch of liberal MPs in South Korea jetted off to China to sort of have this conference, and it wasn't really to tell the Chinese, well, it's not really so bad, and we're going to like only take some of the missiles, and some of the launchers won't be activated, and everything else. I mean, the South Korean left is trying to walk between which I understand. They're trying to walk between the raindrops of these various countries that are all right on top of South Korea, right? I mean, if you're the Americans are not the most credible alliance partner, right?
What do you mean?
You know, I mean, America has, you know, like the Iran deal, stuff like
We've
that.
never
right?
gone into
Donald
any
Trump.
country and screwed that up.
You know, Iraq was a stellar success, right? Yeah. So if you're the South Korean left, you're looking at Iraq, you're looking at the way the Americans, you know, welched on the Libya deal, you're looking at the way the Americans have walked away from Iran, and you're saying, you know, the Americans are sort of like wishy-washy partners. They elect Donald Trump, right? And so we need to have relations with these other countries, most obviously China, right? We can't just sort of like be the leading edge of American power. We're like, you know, flush against China, saying, you know, you're the bad guy. The Americans can say that because they're 10,000 miles away, right? But we're right next to China. And what if the Americans just sort of like walk away one day and say, we want to fight another war in the Middle East, we're going to go attack Iran, and, you know, you're kind of on your own, right? And then suddenly South Korea is all exposed out there. And the South Korean left is conscious of this, which I understand, actually. I mean, it's the China, you know, if you're South Korea, you want to have good relations with China. China's growing, right? China's GDP is going to be bigger than America's GDP by the end of next decade, according to the fund, the IMF, right? And so the South Korean left is trying to like walk between the raindrops on this stuff. And I think that's where its opposition to THAAD came from. And that's where you got all this debate about like THAAD actually wasn't able to do what it was supposed to do. There's a lot of bad information about what THAAD actually does. There are all these ideas. The South Korean left sort of promoted all these ideas that THAAD like had these negative environmental effects, and it had like radiation, and you would get sick if you were near. There was all this stuff, and again, the South Korean left kind of danced around on this kind of stuff because they're really, really wary of openly, obviously aligning with an American, Japanese camp against China, right? South Korean left doesn't want to be aligned with Japan in any way, right? That's just totally impossible because of the occupation period, because of DOCTA, the comfort women, so totally impossible. Right? And open alignment with the Americans against China is also really unwanted because South Korea, whether unified or not, has to live with China indefinitely. Right? So what the South Korean left really wants with the Americans is a siloed alliance relationship completely focused on North Korea only. And when North Korea is gone, then we don't even need the American alliance anymore. We just keep the nukes and go our own independent way with nuclear neutralism. South Korean right is much more comfortable with the American larger architecture in Asia, that we're a part of this larger community. The South China Sea is important. East China Sea is important. Keeping the PLAN penned inside the first island chain is important. South Korean right is much more comfortable with an expansive vision of Korean power, where Korea and Japan and Taiwan and others, Australia, are part of a larger American network, keeping China, Russia, and North Korea at bay. The South Korean left just doesn't want to go down that route because they see it as too apocalyptic, and South Korea could get stomped in the middle if it all goes hot.
Sort of the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, and I think that South Korean conservatives are much more willing to talk about that and much more openly willing to say China is a long-term threat to Korean power, which I think is correct. But the South Korean left is looking for a way to sort of, again, I think, walk between the raindrops. And that's kind of understandable because you're tiny Korea so there's this expression in Korean history, Korea is a shrimp among whales.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're tiny Korea caught between these four countries, like I said before, hopefully you don't get sucked into, what is it, World War V now? Right?
We'll call it that.
Right? And,
Hey, we keep surviving these world wars. They're not that bad.
Right? But I get that. I get that, right? And you don't want to be too American about these things and be like, oh, you're an American ally. You're dependent on us. You should just come along with us and do what we say, right? That was the Bush administration's attitude towards South Korea during the Iraq War, right? You have to go fight this war in the Middle East because you're an American ally, and if you don't, we're going to pull out American troops, right? And South Koreans actually sent people off to Iraq, even though they didn't want to do it, or basically strong-armed them into it, right? And that's what the South Korean left doesn't want. They don't want to get chain-ganged into America's idiotic wars, right? And they look at America since the Cold War, and they see one conflict after another. Yugoslavia, Kosovo, right? Somalia, didn't we get involved in Haiti a couple times in the 1990s, right? And then we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, or Iraq again. I mean,
Syria.
They just don't want to get sucked into this long-running American imperial policing project or whatever the hell it is we're doing. They don't want that, right? It's all about North Korea and fixing that.
You guys have something, or think?
No, I think
That's probably just short of an hour, so that could be a good point. Unless there's like something you're dying to say.
Anything else that really sort of jumps up? Well, let me just sort of talk a little bit, I guess, about the last year and a half or 2 years,
Please.
right? The sort of like the Trump effort on North Korea. I admire the president's willingness to sort of like break with the status quo and actually try something new. I mean, there is an argument out there that says that, bureaucrats talking to bureaucrats, right? American bureaucrats and South Korean or North Korean bureaucrats talking to each other forever through like the six-party talks is never going to lead anywhere. It's just
fail.
Right, it's just years and years and years in this bureaucratic morass, and nothing ever happens, right? And so the South Korean left has always sort of promoted this idea of getting the apex leaders around the table, right? And if the three big guys at the top get together at the table, they can just make a deal and it sticks, and we can just break through this. We can sort of push through this bureaucratic, swamp, right? That's been going on for decades. I actually kind of admire that. I think Trump is totally unqualified to do that. I think that's been one of the big problems, and I've told the South Korean Foreign Ministry this repeatedly, is that Donald Trump he's not Obama, he's not George W. Bush, he just doesn't have the cognitive ability to actually track these issues and understand them well enough to actually deal with Kim, and I think that's been a really, really big problem. When Trump went to Hanoi, his basic offer was CVID, complete verifiable, irreversible disarmament, or nothing. It was basically give up everything, and we'll give you like modernization guarantees or something in the future, or nothing. Right? And Trump just didn't have the ability to actually negotiate in any kind of detail, and the North Koreans aren't going to give up everything, right? So there's no all or nothing solution waiting out there, right? And I think this has really crippled the American ability to actually negotiate with the North, right? Is that the president just isn't taking this seriously enough. He doesn't read the briefing books. He doesn't listen to the National Security Advisor. He just doesn't have enough information to bring to the table to really negotiate. That's why he comes with these all or nothing black and white kind of solutions, CBID and FFVD, because it actually excuses him from actually reading the briefing books and spending the time. The North Koreans are not just going to unilaterally disarm. And I don't understand why the people around the president don't tell him this. The president needs to, besides learning these issues so he can negotiate, the president needs to bring some things that he's willing to concede. And this is the biggest problem with the American debate. The North Koreans aren't just going to give up all their stuff because Trump shows up and says we're going to build condos outside of Wonsan. I don't know why the president talks this way. We need to make a really major concession if the North Koreans are going to make a major concession. Nuclear weapons are really valuable for a state like North Korea. They're surrounded by a lot of other countries, right, who are really, really hostile to them. North Korea is alone, it's isolated, everybody hates it, right? It's kind of globally loathed. It's this weird Orwellian gangster cult tyranny, whatever, all those things we said before, right? And so if you're North Korea, nuclear weapons are a great way to defend your very quirky regime against all these opponents. So they're not going to give them up unless we give them something really juicy. And if you notice in the American debate, there's been almost no discussion about this at all, right? What will we give them in response? Okay, and they're going to ask for a lot, right? And Trump is like, well, you know, MIAs and condos and, you know, modernization and whatever. That's not nearly enough. It's got to be something really, really concrete, right? The North Koreans will be like, okay, I'll give you one nuclear weapon, but you have to remove all the F-35s from South Korea or something like that, right? I'll give you another nuclear weapon, and you have to remove, you know, 40 tanks or something. I mean, the North Koreans are going to they are going to get into the weeds and being counted out like that, right? And what disturbs me is that there's been no discussion on the American side about what we're willing to give up, right? And it's got to be something really big. I mean, you know, if we really want them to like denuclearize, they're going to want USFK out, like all of it out. Maybe we should do that. I don't know. I'm not a diplomat. I don't want to do that. But that's the level of concession they're going to demand. I mean, they're going to ask for something really, really large. And there's been just no preparation at all in the United States to give up something really big. That's how you know the Trump people aren't serious about this. Because if they were, they would be grooming the American public for a really major concession. So, you know, pull all American air wings out of Korea and move them back to Guam or even Hawaii, right? Shrink the size of the 8th Army or pull it out completely. Close, you know, Camp Humphreys and Osan Air Base or something like that. Shrink the South Korean military by half. You know, get rid of all the South Korean military's tanks or something. I mean, you know what I mean? Something really big.
We can't just give them a bunch of Xboxes.
See, that's good thinking. And so what we need to do, what I would like to do, and I keep throwing this around whenever I talk to people, right? Whenever I talk to like South Korean Foreign Ministry and U.S. military in Korea and whatever, I'm always like, rather than giving away something operational and tangible, right? That'll be very hard to put back in later, right? When we left the Philippines in the 1980s, it was really hard to come back. That's one of the reasons why the Chinese are pushing so hard in the South China Sea, because we're not there anymore, right? Once we leave Osan Air Base, we're never coming back. It's going to get bulldozed and turned into condos or something, right? So we should give them something that's liquid, money, right? Why? South Korea and the United States are wealthy, right? We grow every year, right? Just through greater GDP growth, we can make more money. Now, whenever I say this, it's like, oh, okay, so now we're going to fund dictatorship, and we're going to pay for totalitarianism, and we're giving money to fascists and stuff like that, right?
Well, we're already doing
exactly,
it.
Right?
We're already doing it in China.
Okay,
That's true.
But you understand? I mean, you understand where I'm going, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to give up something this big for nothing, and there's been no serious debate in the United States about what juicy concession, what juicy counter concession we will give up. I mean, that's how you know the Americans aren't serious about this, because nobody's talking about it. Where are the op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post? Where are the discussions on Fox News where conservatives are going to have to actually lay some of the groundwork to sell this to the American right? You know, American conservatives are going to freak, right? You know, remember Obama was, you know, giving money to Iran as part of the Iran deal, right? We're paying Iran. Trump used that as a campaign talking point. If we're going to have a deal with the North Koreans, we're going to have to do the same kind of thing, which means you're going to have to prepare the American right for paying off the North Koreans, right? That's going to have to be not interpreted as funding dictatorship. It's going to have to be interpreted as this is part of a deal. There's been no effort to do that. None, right? So of course the North Koreans aren't going to give up their weapons. So what's the point? I mean, what have we been doing for the last 18 months? And whenever I mention this, people are always like, oh yeah, there's a logic there. I'm like, well, yeah. So what are we going to give them? You don't want to give them money because they're going to go blow it on meth, and they're going to import weapons and dump it in Chinese banks and buy more Xboxes.
And they are going to do some of that, though.
They're going to do all that. And I'm just saying that is probably better than giving up these local strategic assets. I don't know. If you guys don't like that, what's your option? But it's got to be something big.
Right.
Does that make any sense? Do you guys get this? It's got to be
needs to
large.
be talked about on Fox and Friends.
Well, so that Trump can.
So that Trump watches it in the morning and then. Yeah.
So I don't know what our give should be, but it's got to be something big. I would rather have it be cash than something more.
I actually
real.
think that people would freak out less about the cash than about pulling
The
all
problem with
troops
cash,
out of.
the problem with the cash option is that Trump demonized the American return of Iranian money as a part of the Iran deal.
I somehow don't expect that would be a tripping point for him.
But you understand, well, the president himself doesn't care because he'll flip in a dime, right? But I mean, it raises massive hypocrisy problems, right? I mean, Trump banged away at the idea that Obama was paying the Iranian dictatorship by flying that money back to Iran, right? I mean, that was a constant talking point on the American right for years and years and years to undercut the Iran deal, right? But for North Korea, the numbers are going to be much, much higher. The numbers are going to be like in the billions for years.
Well, allow me to play devil's advocate for just a moment. You know, the Bush and Obama administration did not have much luck dealing with North Korea. And, you know, over the past couple of years, we had the issue of North Korea doing more and more nuclear testing, more and more missile testing, and it seems to have stopped under what Trump was able to achieve with that. Do you think, I mean, he claims he's Mr. Art of the deal. Do you think he maybe has some sense of different negotiating tactics and inherently knows how to make these kind of deals, while also balancing the fact that he's trying to do something with China and...
I mean, I haven't seen... I mean, we've been talking to North Koreans since, what? March of 2018 is when this thing turned, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
And what have we seen? What deal have the Americans put forward? So far, it's been CVID, which is basically unilateral disarmament. And that's basically what we're asking the North Koreans to do. I mean, the promises we've made in response have been sort of vague promises about modernization, right? That video that Trump showed Kim at Hanoi, or at Singapore. Did you guys see that video? Right? Basically, sort of, this is what North Korea would look like if it was modernized. So that's the one thing, right? And then vague talk about a peace treaty, aid, what was the other thing that Trump was throwing around? Anyway, the point is that all these are sort of like minor concessions. None of them actually really hard and tangible enough for the recognition, right? That we're going to like have some kind of like embassy or something like that. But all that is pretty soft, right? It isn't nearly strategic and solid and tangible and hard enough for the North Koreans to give up the weapons. Right? They might move a little bit on some stuff in exchange for an embassy, but they're not going to give up the core nuclear security they've achieved for that. And that's the problem, right? I mean, they look at what happened to Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi gave up the program in 2006, right? In exchange for, the program was pretty small, gave it up in exchange for American guarantees, a security guarantee, right, that we won't move against him, and some modernization assistance will be coming. Well, we didn't. We welched on the modernization stuff, and then we helped the Arab Spring rebels overthrow him and kill him in 2011. So if you're the North Koreans, you're not going to take a deal where you give up everything today like the Libyans did in exchange for American guarantees to come. Because you saw what that happened to Gaddafi, right? I mean, didn't he get sexually assaulted before he got killed? I mean, you want that, right? I mean, it was really horrific, his ending, from what I understand. So if you're the Kims, you're not going to make that mistake, right? You're going to ask for a sequenced, one-to-one, immediate reciprocal swap, right? Of what you've got that's big and juicy, here are nuclear weapons, in exchange for something really amazing and awesome from the Americans. And because the Americans are not talking about what that concession is, tells you that Trump doesn't have the courage to take on the American right, particularly the Republicans. But also, actually, a lot of Democrats are pretty hawkish on North Korea, too. I mean, Trump is just not willing to go to the mattresses with Congress over giving something really huge away. He's just not willing to do it, right? And
it's possible he just doesn't think it's necessary at this point.
But after two failed summits, right, where the North Koreans keep saying the same thing to us, give us something real. I mean, Hanoi broke up because literally Trump had nothing other to say than CVID in exchange for condos and modernization. I mean, literally, that was the deal. And the North Koreans aren't stupid. I mean, that's what I just don't understand. It's like you walk in there and that's all you're offering them?
Well, I think being able to walk away from a deal is also a way to show something to the Kims. But...
Okay, but I mean, if Trump wants a deal... Okay, so we didn't take a bad deal. So Trump was right. What the North Koreans offered at Hanoi was also terrible. So Trump was right to reject that. But if Trump is going to demand CVID, right, everything, not just like 5 or 10 warheads and 5 or 10 missiles, but everything, well, then you have to offer something commensurately stupendous, right? And that's why the best way to deal with this is to step down a lot and say, okay, You give us 5 nuclear warheads, and we'll give you, I don't know, $20 billion or something like that. I mean, something manageable, right? As opposed to everything. Because everything in North Korea means probably 50 to 100 nuclear warheads. It means, what, like 15 uranium mines? It means something like 40 different facilities all over the country. It means thousands of nuclear science. I mean, the North Korean nuclear program is way, way bigger than what Gaddafi gave up in 2006. So, right, I mean, North Koreans have been working on this for 50 years, right? It's written into the North Korean constitution. I mean, this is like absolutely central to national identity now. They're not going to give that up for, you know, for MIA returns and Trump photo ops and condos and amusement parks. I mean, it's got to be something really juicy. And and Trump had to know that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the arguments, right? That Bolton knew that, didn't tell the president because he wanted it to fail, right? Trump, you know, right? You've heard this argument, right? That Bolton actually wanted Singapore and Hanoi to fail because Bolton wants to use force against North Korea.
I had not heard that.
Right. So that's the idea, right? That's why Bolton keeps talking about the Libya model, because the Libya model is totally asymmetric in America's favor, right? And North Koreans know that. So Trump or Bolton is talking about that because that's how he's telling the North Koreans, we're going to offer you nothing. Then the North Koreans reject it as he expects. And then we go back to where we were in 2017.
And then it's World War VI.
Then it's World War VI. But I mean, Bolton wrote an op-ed during the war scare of 2017 saying, I believe during the war scare, Bolton wrote, we should strike. And Bolton has a record of saying we should strike. And I believe during 2017, he wrote another one of those op-eds in the Wall Street Journal saying we should strike. I mean, you know, that's part of the problem around the president is the president basically has a war cabinet, right? McMaster, Tillerson, Bolton, Nikki Haley, Pence. I mean, all the people that Trump has had around him, Mattis, they're all hawks on North Korea. All of them were more or less comfortable with, you know, the bloody nose, right? Mattis wasn't. But, I mean, there are not many doves around the president encouraging a thicker, fuller engagement process. Instead, it's a lot of hawks who are like, ask for everything, give up nothing. And North Koreans aren't going to do that. They're not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right that it will be very interesting how Trump, North Korea, and China fit into all of this.
There's a deal out there. Kim Jong-Un would not be talking to us if he wasn't interested in a deal. I genuinely believe he's willing to give up some of what he has. Not all of it, but some. And Trump has got to offer him something commensurately big, and it might work.
Yeah.
Is it good for the U.S. to get some?
If we can keep the concession, if we can keep the material assets we have in East Asia, yeah, it's a deal we should make. If we can just give them like money or aid or recognition or something like that, that's cool. We shouldn't give up the assets though. If you give up the assets, then we have the same problem we have in South China Sea. The Americans aren't around when the Chinese and North Koreans start welching on the deal and start doing all kinds of other stuff, and then we have to come back in. And by then, like I said, the South Koreans have plowed over the bases and built apartment complexes and blah, blah, and the South Koreans have moved on and are starting to think that they don't need us. You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, it's been tough for us to get back in with the Filipinos to deal with this mess, right? I mean, it would have been much better if we had managed to get along with them for the last 30 years better and we're around. So, I don't know. We shouldn't give up the bases unless there's no other
That's a very
alternative.
interesting point to hear, yeah.
I don't know. That's a big risk. Right? And once we're gone, it's going to be really hard to come back. Because then the South Korean left will start to see, look, there's a life after the Americans, and we can do this, and we don't need them anymore. They're cutting deals, and and stuff like that. There's kind of inertia now with us around that helps to sort of keep South Korea sort of in the democratic orbit. And without that, I worry that the South Koreans will start running off and cutting their own deals. I mean, maybe they should. I mean, it's their country ultimately, but I still think in the long term it'd be bad for South Korean security because I think without us they'll get bullied a lot by North Korea and sort of treated as a cash cow, like I said, in that covering federation where South Korea basically pays North Korea's bills indefinitely.
So basically what you're saying is you have many, many years of being able to talk to the BBC and have your kids come on so you can start that YouTube channel. Become a rich man.
Nuclear weapons and kids mix really well. They do, man.
They always say
They do.
you can give your kids hugs with nuclear arms.
Yeah, it's where's the red button, Daddy? It works really well, man. Give them that as a gift. Here's.
Well, on that, I think that's the perfect wrap up.
I
Thank you
enjoyed
for
it very
joining
much.
us.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
I enjoyed it
Thanks
very much.
Yeah, our
Thanks.
pleasure.
Thanks. It was my pleasure too.
Thanks for watching.
Oh, before we go, if people
Oh,
want to
yeah.
hear more about what you're saying, where should they go to find
Yes.
Oh, I have a website. It's called Asian Security Blog. Just put that into Google.
It should be called Asian Security Dad.
Yes, it should. I should just put a big picture of my kids dancing. And
There is that gif,
I have a
yeah.
Twitter handle, ROBERT_E_KELLY. So please come and
Follow him
read my stuff.
on
I
Twitter.
would be very flattered if you would.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you
Thanks
to
for
everyone listening. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell,
I'm Jelly John.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
and we'll talk to you next time.